So we're bringing on our first guest now, and she has a very interesting topic. And I wonder if this is, let me see, sometimes this right here, I don't know what that is. Okay. Oh, yeah, it was a smudge or something. I thought it was something like a fly. I was like, what is that? Anyway, when you get on camera, then you see stuff. Um, she has a very interesting book, and I forgot how I heard about the book. Um, I think I was looking for something else. And you know how you on Amazon and similar titles come up? And I said, wow, this sounds interesting. And then I reached out to her. So her name is Katy. I'm not sure how to pronounce the middle name, Morlas Shannon. And we want to welcome Katy to Black Authors Matter TV. And let me ask her to unmute so we can hear you. Um,
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much for
okay.
having me.
Thank you for accepting our invitation. And the interesting thing about um, Katy, when I reached out to her, because her book is called Invisible Blackness, and you have a copy of the book behind you, I think. Can you put it close to the
Yes, ma'am.
camera so people can see it? Is the subheading is a Louisiana family in the age of racial passing. So when I first saw the book, I thought it was a memoir. And so I reached out to Katy and she let me know that she wasn't African American. And was that okay? I said, well, sure. I thought maybe it was a memoir about your family tree because, as you may know, among Black people, we come in all shades from the darkest of the dark to the lightest of the light. So I thought maybe it was you tracing your family roots, but that wasn't the case. But you tell us what made you interested in this whole topic.
Well, it actually is a subject that is found in my own family tree, not my line directly, but in the prologue or the introduction, I talk about the fact that my great grandmother, whom I knew very well, she didn't die until I was 15. She had a great grandfather who had a relationship with an enslaved woman. And this continued after the Civil War. So it lasted for several decades. He had his white family, of which my line is part, and then he had his black family just a few houses over. And they had the same last name and lived in the same small community. And I've reached out to other people on that family line, and we consider each other cousins, as is so often the case here in the New Orleans area. So it was in doing that research that I came to realize that anybody in the Louisiana area, particularly in the New Orleans area, South Louisiana, who can trace their family tree back for any length of time, generations, is going to find this story in their own family. Um, so that kind of led me on the journey to discovering more about it.
Oh, okay. Now you focus on a particular individual in the book, and tell us about her and her name.
Well, her name is Marguerite, and Marguerite was enslaved on a plantation that is called known as Laura Plantation now. It's actually a tourist site, and she was the daughter of an enslaved housemaid there, a domestic who was of mixed racial background. She was considered a mulatress. And was the term that they used at the time, and the overseer of the plantation. And Marguerite was held in bondage by the plantation owner. And she was not, her job there was in essence to service him. It was sexual abuse. She was kept in that house for that purpose, and it was a really appalling situation. But during the Civil War, she was able to escape and leave the plantation. And she ultimately married a white man, a Hungarian immigrant. and she herself chose to identify as white. And they were living in this kind of up and coming neighborhood, and she became friends with a woman named Alice, who had a very similar background to her. And then it's about these interconnected families in the New Orleans area at that time who were descended from both enslaved women or free women of color and white men, and what they had to do to survive and the choices that they made in terms of their identification of their race.
Now, are you originally from Louisiana?
Oh, yes, ma'am. I'm a 10th generation Louisiana native.
Oh, okay. Wow. Wow. And my co-host is from New Orleans. She
Oh,
she couldn't be
wonderful.
on tonight, but she's um from New Orleans. So
Yes.
this would have been a really good I hate that she missed because she had another a family obligation, a graduation today.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
family graduation. But so one of our viewers said that she loves the topic, and as an author, she says, I'd love to get in touch myself. Um, so I don't know if it's get in touch with you. Maybe she'll clarify that. But so you 10th generation Louisiana, that's a lot of generations because I can go back in my particular family, I can go back 7 generations on my mother's side. They
That's
kept really
wonderful.
good records.
That's
But we
wonderful.
couldn't go past the last slave. That was
Mhm.
where we couldn't go beyond her because there weren't enough records for us to
Sure.
find that. So, but that is, I think it was common throughout the South,
Yes,
but
ma'am.
but Louisiana had um, a particularly different, maybe because of the French connection.
Yes.
Can you
It's
talk about
very,
that a little bit?
sure. It's very culturally similar to the Caribbean. And because of the fact that Louisiana was a French colony first and then a Spanish colony, so it's very similar to this kind of Latin Caribbean idea. And even our legal system was different. We followed the civil law. The rest of the United States followed the common law system. So even the laws pertaining to slavery we're different here. And as a result of a number of factors I talk about in the introduction, including the population makeup and kind of what was going on here in Louisiana at the time, plus those kind of more fluid ideas about race that came from that Caribbean background, we have had a tripartite racial caste system in New Orleans. So you had you of course had white people, the Europeans and their descendants, and then you had a large population of free people of color who had been emancipated and who had a great deal of wealth and prestige and were educated and were tradesmen and craftsmen and very skilled. And then you had the enslaved population. So things were literally not black and white ever here in Louisiana. It was always seen as there were these three different groupings, and there was not. When we think today, we think black and we think white, or during those times of Jim Crow, Negro, and white. But in Louisiana, there was always the term colored, and that was this grouping of in between. And of
Okay.
course, the idea of being Creole at the
Mm-hmm.
time, Creole from its origins just meant born in the colony. So it meant anybody born in Louisiana, regardless of race. But then, as time evolved, people began to use Creole as if it meant, a mixture of the
Like
races.
mulatto was like a
Yes.
synonymous with mulatto.
Well, they started to try to because you see all the old Creole families, whether you were black or white, were all interconnected, if that makes sense.
Yes, mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yes, it does make sense. Um, I saw a movie once called, I think it was called Southern Comfort, and it was centered around the Louisiana white people that lived like off to themselves, that were Creole. They spoke like, I don't know what, it's not French. French is like a
Mhm.
mixture of French and English. This, I guess, is it a Creole language?
Well, there
What is
is.
that?
It's called Corivini, but that was more of the Creole enslaved population that spoke that. But yeah, French was commonly spoken here in Louisiana. I mean, up until my grandmother's generation.
Oh, okay. And the aspect of having three different groupings, that was true in South Africa also.
Ah,
Maybe, and maybe some other countries. I know they had the color. You could be black, or you could be white, or you could be colored, which
mhm.
meant you were mixed with
Yes,
something.
yes.
So, but that's interesting about, I know Louisiana, people say they always have kind of had a colorism issue, um, in Louisiana, especially among the black population.
Yeah, they're in New Orleans, that and throughout the plantation parishes that is unfortunately a reality, and that's just part of the caste system that was in place throughout the South because it was all about proximity to whiteness, and whoever was closer to being white could, in some ways, find benefit from it. But at the same time, the system was incredibly brutal to anybody who the one drop rule, of course, existed here, and it was
Right.
1/32. If you had 1/32, a fraction of African ancestry, you would be classified as black. And that was true up until 1983 in Louisiana. When I was 1 year old, the law was finally changed. So,
Oh, okay.
yeah.
Now, someone wanted to repeat the title of the book. So while we're talking about it, it's behind you. It's called Invisible Blackness.
Yes, ma'am.
Mm.
A
And
Louisiana family. Oh,
who's
yes.
that pictured on the cover? Is that Alice?
So this is not, we do not have any extant images of Alice, but this is a wonderful set. This comes from a wonderful series of photographs that was taken during the Civil War by abolitionists from up north to try to raise money for freedmen's causes, and for abolitionist causes as the Union Army came down into New Orleans and occupied New Orleans. They discovered this, population of people who could pass for white, and they were enslaved. And this was contrary to so many Northerners' perceptions of what slavery was. And they had this belief that in showing these Northerners who maybe were on the fence about abolitionism, that there were indeed these children who looked white but were being enslaved, that perhaps that could help move them on the question of slavery. If and they used these photos, they sold them as a means of raising money for freedmen and abolitionist causes.
Oh, Lord. Well, that's something I hadn't heard before. Um, so now, what made you interested in this particular topic? And I'm assuming do you teach college? Are you a college
No,
professor?
ma'am, but I will be going to Tulane in the fall to get my PhD. I've been a professional historian, and more of a public historian for over 20 years now. I've worked at historic house sites, particularly plantations along the River Road, focusing on the enslaved communities there and really telling the stories that had been hidden or erased over the course of time. And that was part of how I encountered Marguerite's story while I was working at Laura Plantation.
Oh, okay. So you're a public historian. So is that equivalent to a librarian, or is it kind of like my niece worked for a time. She got her master's in I don't know exactly what it's in, like historical preservation or something, but her goal was to work at a museum. But her first one of her first positions, and she's moved, she was in New Orleans, but she's since moved to the Atlanta area. But she worked at the Whitley, is it the Whitley Plantation?
Whitney
Whitney
Plantation.
Plantation. She
Yes.
worked there as some kind of coordinator when she first um, got her master's.
Yes, I have my master's degree in history, and in 2005, when I graduated, I went to work at Whitney Plantation in the very early days before it was open, and I
Okay.
did research for them for about 3 years.
Okay, well, it's a small world.
Yes.
She, I would say she was maybe 8 years ago when she worked there, something like
Okay.
that. So you all's paths probably didn't cross.
No, that
Mhm.
was in my very early days of my career.
Yeah. So what got you interested in this specific topic, like this person, this topic of passing, um, or is it your background specifically being a 10th generation Louisiana, or was it something that triggered it,
Mhm.
or just what got you involved in this, the research for the book?
Well, it was a lot of that, that my background and the stories I grew up hearing about history and about the past, both my own family's past and just the past in general here in Louisiana, I could tell that things were being left out, that a whole population of people was not being acknowledged, or when they were acknowledged, were being discussed in a disparaging way or in a way that didn't properly acknowledge the fact that, for example, a plantation is not primarily about the big house and the white family that lived there in opulence. The majority of the people who lived on a plantation were enslaved. They were people of color, they were black. And so when I would visit these historic sites, I would sense that there was a large amount of people's stories that were being completely left out or told in such a way as if they were even acknowledged, they were referred to as the servants. And of course, they were always happy and were well treated. And I just have always been a child who asked questions and was not satisfied with the explanations I was receiving. So I began to do my own research and to really delve into primary source documents. Um, and I also, my faith as a Christian and as a Catholic also had a role in that because I believe we're all children of God and we're all called to see the humanity in each other. And a lot of what I was being taught and learning at church on Sunday was not being carried out the rest of the week. So, um, at that point, I just said, we have to tell these stories and do something to work towards healing and justice. There will never be justice this side of heaven for the dead people that I study. But I can do my part to be a voice for the voiceless and tell their story and, in a way, make sure that people know that they are deserving of dignity and that their stories matter, their lives mattered, and that this cannot go unknown and untalked about anymore. And Marguerite was she was horrifically and brutally treated. She was raped and sexually exploited, and I just could not let that go. And so I had to be sure to tell her story. And along the way, it led to me seeing how there was just really, really horrible things happening beginning in the 1890s in terms of racial violence and brutality and the stripping away of civil rights and lynchings, and that how that led people like Marguerite and her friend Alice and their children to make the difficult choice of having to pass as white or identify as white in an effort to seek a better life for their children. And as a result, I uncovered the fact that the recorder of births and marriages and deaths in New Orleans was on a personal crusade against these families and was outing them and refusing to give them birth certificates or marriage licenses. And, he referred to it as his crusade for the purity of the white race. And this went on through the 60s and the 1970s, even. So there were people whose whole lives were ruined by this. And I felt that that needed to be told.
Oh, wow. So, a couple of things that you mentioned. One, you know, the Catholic faith is very strong in, I don't know if it's just New Orleans or the whole state of Louisiana. Is it the whole state?
All of the South, central down to South Louisiana, yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. Um, and that's not necessarily true. Well, for Black populations in other places,
Right.
it's more prominent in Louisiana. I think probably than any other state, uh,
Yeah.
in terms of percentages. So the fact that people were passing, um, that's not a new thing, and it was common, but it may have been more common. I don't know if there were more people in Louisiana that could pass.
I think
Um,
that was true. Yes.
mhm. Yeah, there were more that had the ability to do it.
And
And
many of them actually went then with the Great Migration, if
mhm,
they could, left and moved to other places. And there are literally thousands of people who could trace their ancestry back here and have no idea that they could be traced back to slavery. They're living essentially, they believe themselves to be exclusively of European ancestry and living as white.
yeah, because they did, you would want to sort of relocate. Otherwise, you could be outed.
Exactly. And there was,
And
that was dangerous.
yes, yes. Um, in putting together the information for the book, what kind of did you encounter obstacles in doing your research, and what were the primary sources of research? And then were you able to find any actual like people with ancestry that would talk to you? Were you able to incorporate that in the book, or was it primarily focused on these two women?
Well, it was focused on these two women in a specific way to tell a more universal story. So their stories and the families connected to them kind of reflect everything that was going on during the period. And I really tried to keep it, I end it in such a way that I don't really I didn't want to incorporate anyone necessarily in the present day because I was trying to be very sensitive and respectful of the descendants. I did get in touch with a few who were very receptive, and I acknowledged them in the acknowledgments of my book, but I tried to keep it in a more historic context as opposed to a contemporary one, if that makes sense.
Yes,
Um,
it
my
does.
research is because the people that I study are marginalized and not really part of the broader historic narrative, it can be very difficult to find information on them. So my research, it's almost like being a forensic genealogist, if you know what I mean. So you have to
Hmm.
dig very deeply and with a fine-tooth comb. And I used everything from courthouse records involving slave inventories and succession records of deceased plantation owners um, to census records, Freedmen's Bureau records, Catholic Church records, which are very beneficial to people here in South Louisiana because the enslaved population here, if they were enslaved by Catholics, they were baptized and may have funeral records, and it makes it much more, it makes it possible to potentially trace them in a way that's not available if they were Protestant. Um, I used a lot of newspaper records, court records, lawsuits, Supreme Court cases from that time. I scoured everything. It was my notes section is very long and detailed, but I've been doing this a long time. So, and this particular story I've been working on, I guess I've been about a decade before it being published.
Okay. Now, is your book published by a traditional publisher or like a university press?
It's a university press. It's Louisiana State University Press, LSU Press.
Okay. All right. So, uh, they would, well, depending on how commercial you could make it, because there've been different books about passing, but they normally are fiction, not
Right.
as many nonfiction or historical books. But it was a very common phenomenon that actually was put to film, several films on it from older classic films. Like
Oh, yes.
there's one, The Band of Angels, that was a movie with Clark Gable and Sidney
Oh,
Poitier, and there was a woman in that. Who played that? Yvonne DiCarlo played the mixed race person who didn't realize she was until her father died, and then it all came out.
mm.
So she was treated, even though she she didn't even know that she had black blood, but she found out. It was depicted very well acted.
There've been a lot of films, and of course Nella Larson. I believe
Yes,
her name, with her book on passing. They then, I believe,
yes,
Netflix made a film about it.
yes, they did. I saw part of it, but I couldn't get into it because the actresses that they had
Mm.
they couldn't pass. I could
Well,
tell
that's
you
kind of
know,
how I feel
it,
felt about it.
okay,
We're
so I wasn't
talking
the only one who noticed. Okay.
no, and we're talking that they looked like the child on this cover of this
Yes,
book.
yes,
So it's not what was depicted in that film, right?
right. There was. And then there's another one, Raintree County. Have you ever heard of Raintree County?
Yes, with wasn't that Elizabeth Taylor?
Yes, Elizabeth Taylor. And she was well, they never came
Mm.
out and said that she was, but it was always inferred that she was the daughter of a slave that her father um, had as a concubine. What
And of course,
her?
Showboat too. Showboat.
Yeah,
Um,
I have I ever seen Showboat? I don't know if I've ever seen
I don't know that I'd recommend it.
it.
Unfortunately, a lot of these stories were not handled well, you know?
That's true. Now, in the one with Liz Taylor with Raintree County, she was they depicted her as being mentally unstable, which was kind of, a way of saying
Hmm.
because she was mixed race, it was just so much going on that she couldn't handle any of it. But Montgomery Clift he was the actor that was her love interest.
They were friends in real life. That was a good combo. I
Yeah,
remember.
and they were in some other movies.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, that was
But
actually a good. It was like a 3 hour movie, or maybe even longer. It's one of those long movies like Gone with the
right.
Wind, but it was similar length. One of
Yeah.
those. It was good. It was
So
actually
it's something everyone's, I think, always known about or whispered about, but
yeah,
hasn't actually approached in a scholarly way or in a way where there's not a stigma attached for a long time. And I understand why it was stigmatized, but I think increasingly we're looking at it almost as an act of resistance because a lot of these people who chose to pass were doing it because so you can look at the number of people who were choosing to pass and the era in which this was happening at its height, and it directly correlates with the most brutal years of life in the South for people of color.
Hmm.
So you're seeing that they were doing it to for economic reasons, for educational reasons, for quality of life reasons, for safety reasons. And so it can become understandable when you think about, okay, my children, what do you want for your children? And then there were, as you said, there were individuals who didn't even realize what their past held. So,
Right. And also, I forgot about Queen. Have you ever seen Queen, which is the sequel to Roots? Well, it was the
oh
opposite
yes,
side of Roots. Alex Haley's
yes.
let's see, which one was the dad? The dad side. The dad side was Roots. Queen
Oh,
was his mother's side.
oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And Halle Berry played in that as the mix. She was the offspring. See, the
Mhm.
her mother was Jasmine Guy.
Yes.
Okay, so Jasmine Guy played the mother. She was in love with the son of the slave, the plantation owner. Then they had Halle Berry, but when she was the little girl actress was played by, I can't call her name right now. The little girl that was in she was in the Cosby Show.
Uh,
Raven Simone. Raven
yeah.
Simone played the little girl. And
Oh,
then when they went to years later, Halle Berry played the adult. And she was always mixed up and confused because she was rejected by, and she tried passing. She did try passing, and it had disastrous results. And but she was always conflicted. She loved her white family, but they wouldn't acknowledge her as part of the family. So that was
yeah.
another depiction that came to my mind.
And in New Orleans and Southeast Louisiana, a lot of these families, the white, and I use that, they're white and then the black, which they're all interconnected, right? So that's kind of one of the themes of the book is that we're all actually interconnected and actually family. But they often acknowledged each other before this whole Americanization took hold in Louisiana. Before the Creole ways, the more Caribbean ways were let go of. After the Civil War, things became Americanized and English would become the official language. And there was just a real profound shift away from the old ways. So these old Creole families who had always known of each other and often acknowledged each other suddenly began to distance themselves. And it's a different kind of pattern and cultural shift than what you see in the rest of the South, if
Hmm.
that makes sense.
It does. Now, you mentioned something in your background that is also mentioned in other literature, that one of your uh, grandparents or great grandparents or great back then
Right.
had a black wife and they actually lived together or something like that. There was, what was that depicted in? Films that are historical always
Mhm.
have an impact on me because if they're done
Yeah.
well, they really do tell the story of what took place.
Right. And in Louisiana, so in my particular case, the white wife was the legitimate wife, and then he had the second family. But in Louisiana, intermarriage was legal between 1868 and 1894. And then with the tightening of the Jim Crow system, it
Okay.
became outlawed. Interracial marriage became outlawed in 1894. And by 1908, they had something called the concubinage Act, which said that black and white people, or people of color and white people, could not even cohabit together, and they were being prosecuted for it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, this is a very, very interesting topic, Katie. And how's your book doing?
It's doing very well. It's on its second printing. I was astonished, and I just am so happy that people recognize that Marguerite's and Alice's stories are meaningful, that their names are being said and their lives are being honored.
Well, congratulations on the book and show it one more time
Yes,
in front of the
ma'am.
screen. It's called Invisible Blackness, and the subhead is a Louisiana family in the age of racial passing. So, thank you so much for being a guest on the show.
Thank
And
you for having me.
you had
It was
some really
delightful.
interesting comments. And I referred your book to one of my really good book customers who loves history, and she bought a copy of the book.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate it.
Okay, you're welcome. Have a great evening.
You too. Take care.
Okay.